Perfect. Okay. So then once again, hi, I'm Christina Rose from the German Film Institute and Film Museum in Frankfurt. And I'm very happy to welcome you all to this webinar on enriching film heritage data with OpenRefine. At the DFF, I am the data coordinator. That means I work with data exchange for cultural heritage data for our own institution, but also for support for other institutions in Europe. And as you can see, this webinar is hosted by us, but is also part of the data space project and the Europeana and EFG project. Sorry. So yes, the European Film Gateway and Europeana. So we at DFF, we operate the European Film Gateway, which is the aggregator for film heritage for Europeana. And the EFG has its own portal where we showcase publicly available digital collections of European film heritage institutions. And you can access this a portal where this link, and it's europeanfilmgateway.eu. And as I said, we are an aggregator for Europeana. And this, on the other hand, is a portal that showcases digital collections of European cultural heritage institutions overall. So you can find there data and objects from museums, from archives, and all other sorts of institutions. Europeana is organized by the foundation, the Europeana Aggregators Forum, where DFF and EFG are also a part of, and the Europeana Network Association. And the last one, the INA, is free for everyone to join who's interested. And Europeana also deploys the European Data Space for Cultural Heritage in a project together with 18 other partners. And we as DFF are one of them. And I have linked the pro page where you can find other information about this. Yes, so let's go right into the topic of reconciling and enriching data. Maybe some of you have already worked with OpenRefine, maybe some of you haven't, but the workflows or functionalities I'm going to demonstrate to you today can serve several aims. So, for example, reconciling and enriching data can help with fixing spelling or variations in proper names. You can link your data into to an existing data set like Wikidata. You can identify URIs for entities. This is very helpful for data exchange with other institutions or to detect duplicates in your own database. And this is the enriching part that goes even further than detecting URIs, is that you can enrich your data with values from other external data sources. So if during this this webinar you think that, okay, this is all a bit too much information, or this is going really fast, I have prepared a handout for you so that you don't actually have to take notes today at all. If you, of course you can, but sorry. I will share this link that you can see here in the chat as well. And there I have added the different steps, the video recordings, which I'm also going to show in the next step of all the workflows. You can, let's put it in the chat here. You can see screenshots and other helpful links to documentation of OpenRefine or of other helpful tutorials that are already available on the web. Yes, I can see some people in there. Just have a look. And if yes, if you have any questions right now or during the webinar, please feel free to share them in the chat. Yes, because what this webinar today will demonstrate is that how we upload and prepare data in OpenRefine, how to get a first overview of how film works are described in Wikidata, because Wikidata today will be my main source of reconciliation. There are, of course, others, for example, the AAT or GeoNames. Then we will see how we use this reconciliation functionality in OpenRefine, how we can fetch data from the reconciled values, and we will have a really quick look at exporting the data using the templating functionality. I see a question in the chat. Okay, Katarina, it's already there. Yeah, that's the link to the handout. Yeah. Okay, what I'm not going to talk about in this webinar is how you actually install OpenRefine, but I have linked up the documentation in the handout. And we are not going to dive very deeply into the all the different data cleaning functionalities that OpenRefine offers. So what we are going to see today is merely the tip of the iceberg of what you can actually do with your data in OpenRefine. Okay. Are there any questions so far? Okay, I don't see any raised hands or questions in the chat. Okay, so as I said before that I have pre-recorded all the demonstration parts where I work directly in OpenRefine with the data I use for this webinar. So I'm going to play this video, and if you have any immediate questions, you can just ask them in the chat, because I will be available during the video presentation. And after each step, we will have time for a short question round if there are any questions. Okay, I will just switch the screen share. Okay. Can you now see the screen with a video? Yes, okay. Then we're going to watch the first step, which is about uploading and preparing the data for reconciliation.
We are going to start our reconciliation process in OpenRefine with uploading our data. OpenRefine lets you upload a bunch of different formats, for example, TSV, CSV, Excel sheets, but also structured and hierarchical data like JSON, XML, RDF data in an XML format. You can select your files here, but it's also possible to paste a URL if there's data to download. You can paste data from your clipboard, and you can connect a database, for example. In our case, I'm now going to upload the data I've prepared beforehand, which is an Excel file with dummy data that represents a bit the typical export of a filmographic database or a film archival database. I will choose my file, and then here you can see in the preview what my data will look like if I create the project.
Sorry, there went something wrong in the screen share. I will skip back a bit. I'm sorry for that.
Database or a film archival database. I will choose my file, and then here you can see in the preview what my data will look like if I create the project. My advantage here is now that my source data was already in a tabular format, so it had columns and rows. If you upload JSON or XML data, it will also be presented in a tabular format. Here I can now see that all of my columns have been imported, and one thing to keep in mind when you work with Excel files that contain multiple sheets, as you can see here now, I have in my Excel file 2 sheets, one for the AV works and one for the non-AV data. If I select them both, the columns will just appear at the end. So the columns of the second worksheet will appear at the end. But for this demonstration, I will only pick the first one with the AV works. Okay, if everything looks okay for you here, you can still rename your project if you want to. I will now call this data preparation and create the project. Now that I've uploaded my data to OpenRefine, I can see it displayed as the table that it is here. I have information on the ID of a film work. I have information on the title and the title types, even once distributed into 2 distinct columns. I have information on the production year. In this case, it's even split into year from and until. I have information on the country of reference, the production companies, director, screenwriter, and director of photography credits. I have IMDb links already present in the data. If I switch to 25 rows in the display, I can see here that there's an IMDb identifier. Next come the manifestation ID. This is just what an internal identifier might look like. I have dimension information in meters and dimension information or duration information in minutes. And I have information on the manifestation gauge. Okay, the first thing you want to do before actually reconciling your data with an external data source is a bit of preparation. The most important thing is that you keep the bit of information that you store in one column distinct. What this means is that, for example, here in the column director, I describe an entity which is a person. So what is given here is the name of a person. But in brackets, there's also the information on the activity that this person has played during the production, indicated in the same cell. When I think about that during reconciliation, the service will take the values that I propose here and search for them in the external data source to create a match. In this case, I'm giving the name, but in the way that this value is presented here, I'm actually saying that this part in brackets actually belongs to the name too, which is of course not correct. So here I describe 2 different things. It's the name of a person and the activity of a person. So in this case, I only want to have the name because the activity is actually already indicated in the name of my column. What I could do now is I can just delete this information from the name. So for this, I go into Edit Cells and Replace. And then I can just type in white space, bracket, director, and closing bracket. And it will replace it with nothing because I leave this here empty. And then voila, now you have all the names without the activity as a suffix. One other thing that will likely occur in your data is that you have more than one occurrence for a bit of information. So for example, for the country of reference, in this case here, I have two distinct countries of reference. This work was a co-production with the country Italy and France. This actually appears quite often in my data here. It's always separated by a pipe, so this is good that I have always the same separator. In this case, I could also use the split into columns functionality, but for the further steps in this webinar, I will use a different one, which is the added cells, split multi-valued cells functionality, which will split my cells here by the separator into distinct rows instead of columns. So now you can see that my information on Italy and France, which was in one cell before, is now stored in two different rows. If you do this, it's important that afterwards you switch from the rows mode, which is the default mode, into a records mode. Because what happens when you split the cells is that you produce a new column, and OpenRefine does not know automatically in the rows mode that this actually belongs to the record number 10 here, but it produces a new record. You will now see that I have 67 rows instead of 55 before, but if I switch to records, I have my 55 records again, because you will see here that these two rows are now indicated as belonging to the same record. I will do this splitting with my other cells where multiple occurrences appear. For example, the director, the screenwriter, and the director of photography. You will notice that the number of records hasn't changed. You will see that for production companies I also have multiple occurrences, but I won't use them for reconciliation, so in this case I will just leave it as is. The next thing, which comes in quite handy when you're working with reconciliation services, is to think about the language that the data source that you want to match your data with stores the data in. So, for example, Wikidata is a multilingual data source, so they support all kinds of languages, but I'm going to use specifically the English reconciliation service. For this reason, it is important that, for example, information on my countries of reference or for my forms and genres, if I have this in my data, are also given in English. If I want to check my distinct values I have, for example, for country of reference, I can of course scroll through my data, but there is quite nice functionality that's called faceting, which offers all kinds of different ways of faceting your data. For us, the text facet is enough here, which then lists me all my values and the count, how many times they appear. It can be sorted by name or by count. So now I can see that I have the term USA 12 times, France 10 times, Soviet Union 4 times, etc. So it actually looks quite good here, but I have, for example, here I have a typo. It's called Frank, that should be France. I have French values here, and I also have some abbreviations, so you can see that USA is written differently here or here than in this value. I could of course now go and change these values by hand. For example, if I click on these, I could just go in here and edit this, but depending on the size of your data, this can be quite a lot of work. I will show you in the next step how you can use reconciliation also as a means of normalization. So as for now, I will leave the values as they are. But one Other nice functionality of OpenRefine, if you want to normalize your data, is the cluster and edit functionality. I'm going to demonstrate this on the manifestation gauge information, which we won't use for reconciliation actually, but it's still a nice feature I want to show you. You can reach this via edit cells and then cluster and edit. And it will group values together that actually mean the same thing. And you can merge them and decide on a normalized value you want to use. There are different functions. For example, you can choose one here, just click through it and see what works best. Here it has even found more clusters. This one wants to cluster information which is actually distinct, so I don't want to use this one. I will decide that the second one actually worked best. So I will merge this one to DCP, this one to 35mm, 17.5, 16 and 8. Merge selected and close. And now you will see that the data has become way cleaner. Okay, we have now prepared our data and we are going to reconcile this in the next step.
Are there any questions so far? I have seen none in the chat. Okay. So if there aren't any questions regarding this first step or the data that I used in general, we can continue with the next part. But as I said, please feel free to just ask away.
So before we dive into the process of reconciliation, it is always good to make yourself accustomed to the data structure that is established in the source you want to reconcile your data with. So for example, I have here a record for a film, in this case The Lion King, and to understand what kind of data might be interesting in Wikidata for film archives, it is good to understand the data model. And I think if these are your first steps in the Wikidata verse, it's okay to just have a look at some example records. You don't have to fully understand the complete data model that Wikidata uses for your first reconciliation. So Wikidata is a database that aims to be able to record somehow everything. So it can cover a very broad range of entities, and the records are always built in a way that they have a label, and then the labels specified in the language. So for example, I have The Lion King, this is the label for English, Der König der Löwen, this is the label for German. Then usually they have some sort of description, and sometimes they have also known as values. So these are the labels. Then there comes a statement that says instance of animated feature film. And now you can already see, if I hover here over this instance of, you can see that this is a property with the identifier P31. And this here is another entity, which you can see that it's identified by a Q identifier. So the Lion King has this Q identifier here, and the animated feature film entity has this Q identifier here. So Wikidata is structured in a linked data format. You will always have a subject, then a property, and an object. So the subject in this case is the Lion King, identified here with this identifier. And now what is listed here is basically a bunch of properties with their objects. As we have a film example here, you can see some of the properties that are usually featured for film examples. So apart from the instance of, You can say it is a part of something. It has a logo image in this case, a title. It is based on, apparently it's based on Hamlet, interesting. Then there are derivative works. It's part of a series. It has subject information. So here are some concepts linked to this. Then you have genre information, a country of origin, original language, a publication date. And now we have some credits here. We have a director, a screenwriter credit, or in this case even more than one, voice actors, etc. I'm going to scroll down now because there are a lot of credits here until I come to another interesting part, identifiers. So one really cool thing about Wikidata is that each entity has its own identifier, but you can also add other identifiers from other data sources that talk about the same thing. So here we have the ISAN number, we have a VF ID, we have ID from the French National Library, from the German National Library, Library of Congress. Then we also have the IMDb ID. You can see you really have a lot of IDs for this case because it's a very well-known film. And each ID then has its own property identifier, of course. So we have here the P3107. As you may have already seen, there is one thing that separates the Wikidata model from, for example, the cinematographic work standard. And this is that we have some information that is now here linked to the film work, which film archives might usually assign more to a film manifestation. For example, original language information, publication date, or information like duration, aspect ratio, color, etc. So I just showed this so that you're aware that when we come to fetching information from Wikidata, in a later step, that you have to be careful that you don't append then information to your work entry that actually would belong to a manifestation entry in your source system.
I would just pause here really quickly so people have the chance to ask questions. In the meantime, in your handout right at the bottom, you can also find an interesting article about the Wikidata ontology and filmographic description of film works or film archival data in relation to this ontology, if you want to have something to read after the webinar. And yes, the article was published on the FIAF website. Okay, so the next step will then be about the reconciliation functionality that I've talked about a lot now, but now you will see it in action, what OpenRefine can do to look for matches, in this case in Wikidata.
For my agents, I will do exactly the same as I did with my country of reference reconciliation. I will copy the column, and then I will run my reconciliation with Wikidata. I'm totally fine with reconciling against the type human, and I will just click on Start Reconciling. Okay, now that the reconciliation process is finished, I will now see my original values and here the matches. So in principle it's exactly the same as with the countries. I can check if, for example, Bulgarian film director and screenwriter matches with the record I have here. Yes, I have a film from Bulgaria with a title that I won't be able to pronounce, but I can see that it's from 1947. If I really want to make sure, I can click on here and I can check his record and see that, for example, his birth dates align with the year of production of the film work I'm going to reconcile later. I could also go to what links here and have a list of all the entities or all the records that are matched to this person. So here I even see that this entry here might even be the film work I'm talking about here. So in this case, that looks really good to me. And here, for example, Wikidata didn't find the reconciliation service didn't find a match, but I'm actually quite sure that this person should be here. And I see that maybe it's just because of the typo. Yes. Here, for example, I would just say now that this is okay. Here for Gary Nelson, I have a lot of matches. So this is a Disney production from 1976. So I will see here I have a film director, NASCAR crew chief, curate, rector, etc. So I can go through this list, but I will just check here really shortly. That looks okay. So of course you can check this in more detail, but for the reason of this webinar, I will go through this a bit faster. Here I have a film director as well. Here apparently it didn't find a match. I'm going to leave this open for now. For other people it worked. Okay, it didn't find Michelangelo Antonioni, who is here. And then again, I will go through this really quickly. Okay, now I have matched all these directors where possible to Wikidata. What I can do now, apart from pulling the labels from Wikidata, there's one thing I can do to check, or just to double check, that I have indeed found a good or at least plausible match, and that is fetching data from the reconciled values. So what we can do now that we have established a match, we can directly pull information from the records in Wikidata that we don't have in our dataset here. So what I do now for checking is that I will just choose occupation, and this takes a while, and we'll say OK. And now it will give me, for every person I have matched, a list of the occupation that is listed in their Wikidata entry. And now I can already see that I see a lot of film directors here, which is good. But I could do some text faceting just to make sure. If I remove this here, if there are some values that seem a little bit odd. So for example, business person, I'm going to check this. I'm also going to check the engineer or the entrepreneur, the journalist, mathematician, looks interesting, manufacturer, pedagogue, physicist is also a bit suspicious, teacher, okay. Okay, so one was Walt Disney. I'm pretty sure that this is a correct match. So I'm going to ignore this. Here it just has listed a lot of occupations. And this Czech director looks good as well. Okay, Max Reinhardt was apparently also a university teacher. Okay, so the engineer and mathematician was Thomas Alva Edison. But this is okay, I'm pretty sure that this is the correct match. So if you're not sure, you can always try to find good other properties to pull in. And one other thing, for example, would be the date of birth. So if you then have values that say like 1502, you can just double check this based on this list you just pulled. Since this is adding a lot of additional rows, I'm going to delete this column now again. And we will continue with the matching of the other two columns and then finally match our film works. Okay, now that I have matched all my credited agents to Wikidata, we can see now very nicely how these names have been normalized to the label this person has in Wikidata, and that it can really differ in some cases. Now what I'm going to do is I will match my film works, which this was all about, and now you will also see why we have gone through this effort.
I have to pause this video for a second because I realized that during the editing of the video I missed one part, or left one part out, which was the how you can add a reconciliation service to your to OpenRefine and how you pull the labels. Because as you can see, the countries are already matched. I'm really sorry about this. I will just demonstrate this live now. I would just have to switch my screen share. So this is this one. Okay. Can you see my OpenRefine screen now? Yes, okay, perfect. So what I skipped, unfortunately, but we'll add later on in the video you can also rewatch on Vimeo, is the country of reference matching. The concept is always the same, so you already saw how it works with the agents. But what was missing here was that if you go on reconciling here and start reconciling, you will find the services that you have already added to your reconciliation workflow, so to say. But if it's your first time reconciling, this will be empty. And to have the services listed here, you have to add them and add the URL where this service can be accessed. To find out what URL you actually need, you can go on Discover Services, and you will be redirected to a service test bench where you can also test it out before. But here the first one is the one we have used for the agents before, and you can just copy this URL and then say add standard services and add service. This will always take a while. But what you can see here in brackets, the EN, and in comparison here, the DE, this indicates the language which Wikidata language you're actually using. So then if you have added the service, you can, then you see the screen again that I also had with the agents, where you can choose the entity you want to search for. So it proposes me sovereign state, but I'm going to go with country. And then you can say start reconciling. And you will see here that it takes a while. This is also why I pre-recorded this video so I can edit all this waiting time you will have out. For a short or for a small data set with 55 records, this goes actually quite quick. If you have 4,000 or more, this will take a while. So we're already at 34%. Yes. Okay, and now it's exactly the same as with the agents, which I showed in the video, that you get results that you can choose, or you can just leave them open or discard them. I'm just going to accept some here. You can also say that if you click on this little symbol, you only accept for this cell, but if you say, okay, all my Italy's in this data mean the same, you can say accept all. And the one thing I did with the agents, which I also did for the countries that I'm going to demonstrate now in retrospective, is how you can pull the label that Wikidata is using, because you can see here what term they're using, but if you click on here, you will still see the old value from your original data. So if you then go on edit column, add column from reconciled values, you can say L, which stands for label, and then EN, which gives you the English label. If you would go for DE, you can go for the German label, etc. Okay, this also takes a bit, and then you have the labels here. And now we're back to the status that the video is in. So I'm sorry about this, but if you want to rewatch this on Vimeo, I'm going to add this in again. There's a question in the chat. What would you do if the name variation that you have in your database for the person is correct, as opposed to the variation given in Wikidata? There might be cases like that with small languages, lesser known filmmakers. Yes, that's a good question. So if you, I will talk about this actually also later, that pulling data from other data sources is of course also a question of trust that you put in this external data source. In the case that I have here, I'm actually not going to use the labels further on. I will just make sure that I make it as easy as possible for Wikidata to find the matches. So in this case, if I want them to search for a film work in the next step and say the director is this and this person, I'm going to, from the reconciliation I did before with the agents, I have the label that Wikidata uses and will feed them this label as well. So yes, in general, I would also say that if you agree more with your own data, keep your own data, and maybe only import the identifier so that you have a match between your database and another database. But so that the match can be established easy, but don't overwrite your own data. That would be my advice. But of course, there might be different cases where it can also be good to copy the data directly. Did that answer your question? Okay, I hope so. If not, okay, yeah, great. Okay, then we will continue with video.
The concept is the match my film works, which this was all about, and now you will also see why we have gone through this effort. The concept is the same. I pick Wikidata. It already proposes me to match it against film, but I am going to include other information in my table for the searching, so that in the end I hope to get better matches or suggested results because I can refine my search in Wikidata. So for example, I will include the original title as title. You can now see here, it suggests me the property P1476, published name of a work. Because I have a lot of German distribution titles in my data, you can see that here, I will propose this as the German label. Then I only have a production year, and as we have seen before, Wikidata lists the release date. So I will list this as the publication date. So this is P577, but I'm only going to take the year. So it's P577 at year. I'm going to use this label, which is the label I pulled from reconciling my countries. So this is country of origin. You can see this here, country of origin of this item. For example, a creative work. I'm going to leave out the production company, but I'm going to include the director. Oops. And the director of photography. The IMDb identifier, I'm going to use this as well. IMDb ID. Okay. And now with all of this extra information, I'm going to click on Start Reconciling and see what the result will be. Okay, so the results are in. 40 works have been matched automatically. So here, for example, we have A Brief History, 1956 film directed by Ion Popescu Gopu. And this looks good, a Romanian film. I don't have a production year in this case in my data, but the director matches as well. Queen of Spades, this looks good as well. Fist of Fury, interesting. I will click on this to see, the German title actually matches my data. So now again you can click yourself through these matches and also the ones that haven't been matched to see if there are some results missing. For example, my Bulgarian film work, where I saw by clicking on the director that this film is actually in Wikidata, I can then again search just like this. Apparently it doesn't find a match here, maybe because of this one here. Okay, this doesn't work at all. I'm going to try this with the German title directly here. You can always do this, and now I get a result. So what I'm going to do now in this case, because it's the quickest, I will put this Q identifier, search for match, and there it is. This is interesting. It didn't find this one because of the title maybe. So if I'm going to search for this, yes, there it is.
Just one quick note, because I showed for the agents matching that you can pull in information about the profession or occupation of an agent or the birth dates to inspect your matching results as well. You can do this same thing with filmworks. So what I sometimes did was to fetch the release date from Wikidata. We had a look at it before that this property exists. And then you can check the year of the release date against the production year you might have in your own data, and can see if there's a match, if there's an overlap. And if there are like 20 years of difference, then it's very likely that you have a incorrect match. Okay. If there are no other questions, we will go on with step 4.
Now that we have established all the matches for our film works that we could find on Wikidata, There is one more thing that I would like to demonstrate in this webinar, and this is how you can add data that is in Wikidata to your own data export. Kind of data you want to add from an external source to your own system depends on how much trust you put in this external data source. So, for example, Wikidata is a community-based database, so everyone can contribute. That is, on the one hand, the reason why there is so much information and also a lot of multilingual information that might not be present in other data sources. But on the other hand, you have to keep in mind that this information might not have been gathered by film historians or other professionals from the area. So one bit of information that could be considered a little less critical, but is really helpful if you are thinking about exchanging data with other archives or filmographic databases, is to fetch other identifiers for your film work. And as I showed before, the Wikidata really has a lot of properties for other identifiers, also for film works. So we are going to click on Edit Column, add columns from reconciled values, and then we are going to look for some identifiers that are typically assigned to film works. So we have the IMDb identifier, and then you will see in this little preview window where actually this sort of identifier has been recorded in Wikidata. So it looks like for almost all of our matched film works there is a IMDb identifier present. Not here. Okay. We are going to add, for example, the film portal identifier. Oops. This, of course, applies only to films from the German filmography. We can also add, for example, the ISAN number. If I click on OK, this might as well take a while. Yes. And now I have 3 additional columns with my identifiers. Other information I could add, for example, are genre information. This information here, of course, depends on what genre information people have added to a film work on Wikidata. As we have seen in our original data that we don't have a lot of information on screenwriters and directors of photography, so we could fetch this information from Wikidata, but as I said, keep in mind that this information, that the information there are not, so to say, authority records, but it's a community-based database. But I can do this. I can type in screenwriter, and it will give me information here as well. While I'm at it, I'm going to add the director of photography as well. And I'm going to click on OK. You can see now that sometimes a lot of rows have been added. For example, here I have 3 genres attached to my film work. Or if I scroll down here, there are several screenwriter credits for this film work. What is interesting now is that I could even go further and then add information from these values again and again, so I can expand my data quite a lot. One last bit of information is that I'm going to show you how you can get the Wikidata URIs. So if I go, for example, to the film work, I can add this quite easily by clicking on Reconcile and then add Entity Identifiers column. So you will now see all the queue identifiers. But maybe I want to have the whole URI, which I could use when I'm, for example, working in a linked data context. For this, I will go to Edit Column, Add Column based on this column, and I'm going to call this Wikidata URI. And I'm going to just concatenate two values, HTTP. I'm going to click here. I'm just going to check. And yes, it now leads me to this Wikidata entry. And please be careful that the URI you need in your data is not the one that is shown here, but it is the one that you can get by clicking on copying this link. You will see that this has the HTTP and the entity instead of the HTTPS and the wiki part here.
Okay, looking at the time, I will just let the last step play, and then we can have a discussion or ask questions again.
After you have finished with all of your cleaning and reconciling work in OpenRefine, the last step would be to export your data. I will close this here. You will see that I've changed the display of my data back to rows mode. This is because you will see that I've added some columns to my data. For example, for the URI of the instance of data I gathered before, or for example for the countries of reference. And in addition to this, I have joined all the cells that I've split before. So now I'm back again in the rows mode, and I have my 55 rows again. I did this because it makes the templating function, which I'm going to show you in the next step, a bit easier. I've added some new columns to my data. For example, the URIs for the instance of reconciling data, or for the country of reference URIs. And I have also added rows for each occurrence of director, screenwriter, etc. If you want to export your data, you find several options here in the corner. You can archive your whole project, so you can share it with others, or you can work on it again on a later stage. You can export your data in TSV or CSV files, Excel files, or ODF. There are other options here as well. All this depends on what you want to do next with the data that you gathered or cleaned. For example, if you want to re-import it to your local database, you may need other options than if you want to share it directly with other parties. One functionality I want to show you now is the final point of this webinar, is the templating functionality. If you click on this option, you will get a new window which lets you define your template for exporting. The first you will always get is a JSON template, so that you can export your data in a JSON format. But you are actually quite free to produce whatever kind of data you want. What I did, and also linked to your handout, are two exemplary XML templates, so that you can once try out how you can export data from this table directly to XML in the EFG format. That's the one that the European Film Gateway uses for importing and exporting data. And one template that shows how you could generate EDM data directly out of this table. That's EDM stands for Europeana Data Model, and that's of course the data model that Europeana uses for importing and exporting. So let's copy the template I have prepared into these boxes here. You always have to define a prefix, so that's the wrapper for your whole file. The row template that gives instructions about what to do with the data in each row. The separator between the records that are produced by each row, and then a suffix which wraps up the record. So let's start with the EFG schema. Okay, so I've copied my data here. I won't go into further detail about how to write these templates, because that would be a webinar on its own. But you can find these in the handout, and if you want to have a further look into these options, you will find there some examples for writing if conditions, for excluding empty cells, splitting multiple occurrences in one cell. In the right-hand window, you will see a little preview of what your data might look like. You can see here that I have actually a lot of empty rows here. This is because I excluded empty cells in my template, but it then produces an empty row where there's no data. But you could just throw this out afterwards, after you after you have saved your file. So if this all looks good for you, you can click on export and then save your file. The other template is an EDM template. For this one I will facet to only export the records that have a Wikidata match. So if you filter your data and then click on export, you will only export the matching rows. You can see some empty rows here as well, but in this example the record is a lot shorter or more compact. This is because for exporting data to Europeana with the EDM format, you can, for example, for the creator here, or for the country of production here, it's sufficient to just indicate the URI, because Europeana can dereference the URIs and add the labels on their own. These templates that you're very welcome to have a look at are not meant to say that this is the best way or the only way that you could map your data. It's just an example of how such a mapping template works and how the data could be mapped to EDM.
So looking at the time, we almost finished on 12 p.m. So if you have to leave now, you can find the recording afterwards on Europeana and rewatch the rest of the webinar. I have answered some questions in the chat. There's another one. Will my project automatically be updated if its source file of my organization is updated? I think that depends on what way of importing you use. So if you import an Excel file, this is the state that you're working with. So if you then change something in your source file, you would have to upload it again as an Excel file. But I'm not quite sure how this works with fetching data from URLs. It might be possible that there's the possibility that the data updates itself in your project. I'm just not sure. I think if you connect it to a database, I showed this option in the beginning, which I also haven't tried out myself. There, it might be even a greater possibility that you have updated data in your OpenRefine project. Okay. Yes, the other questions were similar. So if the data you pulled from Wikidata gets updated in your project, I think it won't be updated for the labels or the information you already pulled. But if you, after some months, refetch data from your reconciling match, it should pull the data that is now present in Wikidata. Oh, sorry, I misunderstood one question. Sorry, you said Java. Yeah, I read JSON. I'm sorry, I really can't answer that question because I'm not so familiar with the programming of OpenRefine. But one thing I know is that you can allocate more memory space to OpenRefine if you experience that the program is running slow. So it has some default mode, so to say. And then if you see that your project or that it takes forever to reconcile or something like this, or that it freezes, then you can change this. You can change the setting. There are some there's documentation for this on the web. I can also add it to the handout later. Yes, good question. Yeah, the question was, is it too slow? Yeah. Is it possible to connect links to the videos URIs for further use? I'm not sure which video URIs you mean. So the question was, is it possible to connect links to the videos URIs for further use it for video annotation? Okay, so I'm not sure if I understand, but you can reconcile in OpenRefine with all the services that offer this functionality. So I showed you this list before, this test bench. There you can see which data sources offer this kind of service. So I think Wikidata is maybe the best known, but there's also the arts and architecture thesaurus. And actually, the list is quite long already. So if you find there a data source where you could match your video URIs to, then I think you could use it for reconciling. You can also, there's also an option to reconcile against two local data sets. So if you have stored, for example, two CSV files and you want to find matches, that's also possible. But it needs some further installation. But also for this, there's documentation on the web I can add to the handout. I've tried this once, but you have to run it locally. It doesn't establish a web connection. Yeah. I hope I somehow answered your question. Okay. If there are no further questions from your side, I would have some for you, actually. Let's see. So as the last bit, I was wondering, since you all possibly work in the film heritage domain or in the data domain. What opportunities you see for film heritage when you now see this reconciliation opportunity, or what OpenRefine and publicly available data sources offer. So do you know any other data sources that might be interesting for film heritage? And which other entities could profit from reconciliation options? My first thought would be manifestations, because as you have seen, there's information on Wikidata which might actually be more related to a manifestation. And if film archives have structured their data in a work manifestation item hierarchy, this is of course an important entity. Or would you know about what do you think, what controlled vocabularies might be interesting for film heritage data? So if anyone wants to join the discussion. I hope I didn't scare you now, because I don't see any videos. Okay, there's one reaction in the chat from Anna Bohn. Filmographic data from national film archives could be preferred sources for the film depending on country of origin, for instance, BFI or UK films, yes. AFI for US feature films. Some of them may be public source. Yes, that's a good point. Countries have published their national filmography in a way that the data is openly and machine readable, so accessible for machine readability. This would be a good source for filmographic data, so for film works, and maybe also for manifestations. That's correct. It's a good point. We're also quite multinational audience today, I think, so it would also be interesting to hear if and people know from a national filmography for their country. Regarding the controlled vocabularies, I think it would be really interesting to see maybe a more controlled, or well, more controlled than Wikidata maybe, vocabularies for color techniques, for gauges, for base types, etc. So there's a lot of knowledge in this film heritage community, but I think the information still has to get machine readable, for example. So I think there are a lot of great opportunities to have a really deep and reusable vocabularies for these parts of cataloging. Yes, we have a vote for well-training AI for film heritage purposes. Yeah. What kind of AI uses would you imagine there? I think image recognition is always a big player in this field when we come to audiovisual cataloging, of course. Sorry. I'm sorry. You can't unmute yourself. That's not good.
Yeah, so for me it works.
Yes. Yeah.
I don't
know.
No, that's Katarina speaking.
Okay,
I just said it works from my end.
A moment, maybe.
With the microphone.
Does it work now for you, Radoslav? No, it doesn't work. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, I'm really sorry. I don't know how to change this setting. Okay, so yeah, I'm sorry. But if you want to say something in the chat, then I will read it out to the others as well. I'm sorry. But yeah, maybe in the meantime, the last question that would actually interest me if you have, for example, if you have a collection or if you host data on film heritage, what kind of data would you like to share with others, or what kind of data would you be interested in to see from others, from other institutions? So I know that, for example, for film archives, there's always a big interest to see the archival holdings of other institutions, to see if they might have some material they could use for digital restoration, etc. There are also already projects in Europe where you can search for archival holdings, for example, on Film Portal. Okay, we have the AI comment. Okay, shortly, training for automatic gauge recognition. Okay, that's cool. Training for semi-automatic recognition, making connections through invisible otherwise things. Yes, automatic gauge recognition. That's really interesting. That would also, of course, be very well. What do you say? Could work well together with the vocabulary for gauges and more information appended to the different gauges then as well. Yes. Recognize the film period and the author. Okay, that's also interesting. Okay, we have one other comment, that there's a public archive of cartoons and 35mm overhead projector films produced in the USSR and Russia. Thank you for that. Okay. So if there are no further comments or questions, I think we can resume this webinar. I just want to say that I thank you a lot for attending and for your yes, and for your comments and your interest, most of all for our little event here. If you have any further questions regarding this webinar or regarding OpenRefine in general, you can contact me at my email address. I'll type it in the chat as well. And one last bit maybe before you leave is that there is a post-event survey that I will post in the chat now, but you will also receive a follow-up email next week where you can also find this link. It's just a very quick survey with 5 optional questions where you can give a little bit of feedback if you want to. And here it is. Okay. Then I wish you all a very good day, and thank you for having joined us today. Yes, and maybe again for people who have joined later, again, the link to the handout, but you will find this in the follow-up email as well. Here it is again. Okay.